There's a terrorist group that's become one of the greatest threats to international trade. That's right, we're talking about the Houthis. We're about to talk a lot about the Houthis and how they have not been deterred and how their strikes are actually starting to cause some real problems in the region. First, I want to talk about the Houthis and how they have caused some environmental risk and why that matters. Now, before you click off the video after commenting, whoa there, hippie, let me explain, because it makes sense. The Houthis attacked a civilian carrier on February 23rd that was carrying crude oil, and that caused an 18-mile slick. Now, that's not that much in comparison to other kinds of oil spills that we've seen, but it certainly can cause some environmental risks, especially if they manage to hit other bulk carriers that cause other types of oil spills like that. Obviously, oil kills fish and plant life, and fishing makes up about 15% of the Yemeni economy. Now, again, like I said, one 18-mile oil slick is not going to kill off all the fish in the region and destroy the Yemeni economy. But if this becomes a trend, and the Houthis, continue to strike civilian ships, and a lot of those civilian ships are bulk oil carriers, and they cause large spills, then that could actually begin to impact the environment and impact the fishing industry in Yemen. Now, why exactly does this matter? Because it sounds like a really kind of convoluted roundabout argument, but it's really not. It's not necessarily that I'm worried about Nemo choking to death. Economic opportunity or lack thereof can be a huge cause of radicalism. And the Houthis, even though they would be at fault, they can spin the whole situation as being the fault of the Americans and the Israelis. I mean, if, Israel didn't attack Gaza and if America wasn't, in the Red Sea, then the Houthis would not be striking civilian ships. They wouldn't have a need to. They wouldn't have been at war. At least that's what they can spin it. And think of young Yemeni men that are down on their luck. They're struggling to find jobs. They're struggling to find fishing jobs. And perhaps they're even struggling to find food, not only because, UN aid isn't really reaching Yemen, but also because the fishing economy is starting to fall apart. As a result of environmental damage, you start to get a scenario where that civilian, that young Yemeni man, might become radicalized because he's receiving the messaging that, the reason that everything is going wrong in your life is because of America or it's because of Israel. And we fight them. And so if you want to come join us, then join us. He might see them as heroes in this society. He might know friends that had joined the Houthis. And so that's really kind of how that cycle of radicalization can happen here. And that's how, an environmental disaster that you may not really consider with being part of that radicalization process can actually become part of that radicalization process. And that's just one scenario. I mean, obviously there's other, scenarios to consider here, but that's just one risk that I wanted to discuss here. But luckily for us, it gets worse for everybody else because the Houthis have managed to damage an undersea cable or several. This has caused some internet outages in Djibouti, and the Houthis had previously threatened to do this. They've threatened to cut undersea cables, and of course I personally laughed that off because I was like, yeah, okay, how are you going to do that? Well, that's because I'm an idiot, and I didn't consider, maybe they just have divers, and they can just do that. So I'm an idiot. Well played, Houthis. So these disruptions could cause some kinds of telecommunication and internet outages for not just people in Djibouti, but also for the U.S. troops stationed there as well. So that's not phenomenal, and we don't love that. Not only can information sharing and telecommunications be impacted, but emergency services as well as online businesses can be impacted as well. Now, these have been the strikes recently. So what have the U.S. and the U.K. really done about it since? Well, it's been more of the same, honestly. They've still, continued their series of airstrikes on Yemen. They've still continued to target the Houthis with airstrikes, but clearly the Houthis are not deterred. They've not only continued their strikes against civilian ships, they've escalated their strikes. They've scored hits. They've managed to cut undersea cables, which was a piece of infrastructure that they threatened to escalate the fight to. The Houthis clearly are not worried about the situation. They're not worried about what the U.S. and the U.K. are doing. And, I kind of want to take this point to discuss, what's in the future here? Like, what are we doing? Are we just going to wait for the Houthis to hit a U.S. Navy ship and kill American service people? Or are we going to wait for them to continue to hit more civilian ships and kill civilians? Or are we going to wait till all of international trade decides, you know what, the Red Sea is too risky and we're just going to go around, and that's going to cause its own economic impact? What's the end game? What are we looking at here? Clearly, you know, the current trajectory that we're on, it can't really continue because it's not a good trajectory for anybody. Boots on the ground cannot be an option. You know, you'll be hard pressed to find anybody in the United States advocating for that. But at the same time, an air campaign by itself, shocker, it does not comprehensively destroy an insurgency. And that's really because there are a lot of things that you're blind to by just limiting yourself to an air campaign, especially if you're not willing to put troops on the ground. If you think of, you know, every soldier as like an individual sensor that's collecting and relaying information, right? Then you would, whenever you put troops on the ground, you end up with a lot of information sensors. So you get better fidelity on the information you're collecting. You're collecting a lot more information, and that helps your, you know, with the airstrikes that you're launching be more accurate, be more effective. You know, you're targeting better facilities, and you know where to attack, because it's not like you're just observing something from like the air or from space, where you think that this is an enemy warehouse, but it may not be, and it might not, you know, have any, you know, significant strategic impact on the Houthis. Whereas if you have, you know, troops on the ground, they're able to go kind of into the community and identify, okay, well, this is a building that we weren't even looking at before that turns out it is a headquarters. And that's an important situation, right? But again, I think we can all agree we should not be putting troops in Yemen. That would be absurd. You know, nobody wants to put more American soldiers, you know, on the ground in the Middle East. Where we should be moving on, right? So if we're not willing to do that, then what are the options? Because clearly that implies that there is a limit to what the United States and what the UK is really willing to do over the situation. And that's something that the Houthis have clearly picked up on, and by extension, Iran has picked up on. They know that there's a limit to what the US and the UK will do, so they're going to run up to that limit and maybe run just beyond it. And that kind of takes us to this theory on escalation management, because you might see this on Twitter sometimes. It kind of refers back to a little bit the escalation ladder that we've talked about in previous videos. Really what you want to do in the situation against your adversary, and I say you, what the U.S. would want to do in this situation, is be in control of how far up the escalation ladder, you know, the United States and its adversary are going to go, and kind of control the ascent if necessary, but always be willing to go a step further than the adversary, so the adversary decides it's not worth it, and then they start crawling back down the ladder. In this situation, clearly, I think we can all agree the U.S. does not have escalation. They do not have control over the situation. The Houthis have not only taken us up the ladder, but they appear to be a step ahead. They appear to be willing to target infrastructure and civilian ships and other kinds of sites that we're not willing to effectively defend, and we're not willing to deter them from doing that. And so that really leaves us with a few options, and I don't want to get into all the options. I don't want to, you know, kind of speculate here, because that's not only dangerous territory, but it gets too speculative, and I don't want to do that. But here are just a few general options that we have. One is to leave altogether. And obviously that would be incredibly unpopular, and we can't even necessarily do that because U.S. flagged ships do get granted U.S. protection, or they, you know, can't afford U.S. Navy protection when transiting dangerous waters. Obviously, that hasn't necessarily made a difference in the Red Sea because the Houthis are targeting American flagged ships. So a lot of ships are switching over to other kinds of more neutral flags. But we could just leave altogether. Obviously, that's also going to be very unpopular amongst our allies, and that really has bad implications regarding Ukraine and Taiwan. Because if it shows, okay, well, if the U.S. is pushed far enough, they'll go away. And that's something that Russia has thought about, and we've talked about that regarding the war in Ukraine. That's something that China is considering regarding the war in Taiwan. And so if you set that precedent, then that is a precedent that other adversaries will pick up on. And you have to consider that. Yeah, we can also just keep the same strategy and cross our fingers. That does invite a lot of risk as well, because again, clearly the enemy is not deterred. Clearly the Houthis are not deterred. They're going to continue these strikes. And so there's a lot of, I have questions on the wisdom of keeping the same strategy if the same strategy is not really proving effective. And another option is to simply escalate. And now, you know, I want to get into what that escalation looks like, or what that would require. There are a lot of options, but with where we are, I don't know how effective some of those options are going to be, if we're not willing to take the gloves off, so to speak. And I'm not advocating for that. I'm just kind of wanting to kind of think through this situation with you on how this situation can be incredibly dangerous, and how it really poses a lot of risks for U.S. strategy and policy, where it could become another quagmire. And, are we willing to get stuck in another quagmire that we didn't want to be in the first place because something else that is not under our control is going on? There's a lot of questions there. We'll just have to continue to wait and see what the U.S. and the UK choose to do, and we'll have to wait and see what the Houthis continue to do, because clearly they're not deterred. They're continuing their attacks. They're, doing these massive, marches, like hundreds of kilometers, kind of as a show of force, to show it's, kind of symbolic of like a march to Israel, that they're willing to support Israel they're willing to fight Israel and support Palestine. I understand that there's a lot that we're not necessarily seeing in the news that might be, being done over this situation. Where we're at right now, the Houthis they're just kind of doing whatever they want right now. So with all that being said, I want to know your thoughts down below. Comment your thoughts on, what do you think the United States or the UK should do? How effective do you think this current strategy has been? And do you feel deterred? I will talk to you all in tomorrow's video as well. We've got some interesting topics to go through tomorrow. And potentially the next day. So do hit that subscribe button and like this button if you found it helpful or informative. I'll see you all next time. Later.